They said the photograph was harmless. Just a family portrait. Just another forgotten image from 1901. But photographs don't lie. They wait, and this one waited more than a century for someone to look at it long enough. The photograph was found inside a cedar chest that had not been opened since the early winter of 1902. The house stood on the edge of a dying railroad town, its name long scratched off maps, swallowed by weeds and memory. When the chest was lifted, the hinges screamed like something protesting resurrection. Inside were quilts, yellowed letters, a child's shoe, and at the bottom, a single mounted photograph wrapped in oilcloth. At first glance, it looked ordinary. A family of 5 posed in front of a white wooden house. Father seated, mother standing. 3 children arranged carefully, hands folded, expressions neutral in the way people learned to be when exposure times demanded stillness. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong, and yet everyone who saw it felt the same sensation. The feeling of being noticed. The photograph was taken in late autumn of 1901, according to the studio stamp barely visible on the lower corner. Rural Missouri. A traveling photographer. A long exposure. A simple moment preserved. But moments, when frozen incorrectly, do not stay moments. They become records, and records can testify. The first person to notice the detail was a clerk cataloging estate items. He stared longer than necessary, trying to place why his chest felt tight. It wasn't the faces. It wasn't the shadows. It was the boy on the right. He was the youngest, maybe 6 years old, standing slightly behind his siblings. His head was tilted just a little too far, as if listening to something just out of frame. Children in old photographs often blurred. They moved. They breathed. They failed to hold still. But this boy was sharp. Sharper than the rest. His eyes were not aimed at the camera. They were aimed past it, directly toward whoever would eventually look. The clerk laughed it off, until he noticed the hands. The boy's right hand was gripping the edge of the chair his father sat on. Fingers curled tight, knuckles pale. The kind of grip someone has when they are holding on so they don't fall. Except the chair leg cast no shadow beneath that hand, and shadows never forget to exist. By the time the photograph reached the local historical archive, 3 people had already refused to catalog it. One claimed it gave him headaches. Another said the boy's expression changed when no one else was in the room. The third quit his job entirely. The photo was labeled anyway. Unknown family, circa 1901. And then it waited again. The second detail revealed itself slowly. It required silence, time, the kind of attention modern eyes rarely give. The mother's face, when examined closely, showed signs of strain. Not grief, not fear, control. Her jaw clenched too tightly, her eyes slightly unfocused, as if she were concentrating on keeping something from moving or speaking. The photographer's notes, found years later, contained a single odd remark. Had trouble with the youngest. Wouldn't stop responding. No further explanation. In 1901, photography was not instantaneous. Exposure times lasted long enough for breaths to matter, for movement to betray itself, for the living to blur, for the dead to stay perfectly still. That was why families sometimes posed deceased children among the living. It was not uncommon. Death came often. Memory fought back with images, but those children were always placed carefully, supported, arranged, never allowed to stand, and never allowed to grip. The third detail was discovered decades later, after the photograph was digitized. An intern noticed something odd while adjusting contrast levels. In the glass of the house window behind the family there was a reflection, not of the photographer, not of the street, but of a shape standing just inside the doorway, small, too small to be an adult, and positioned directly behind where the boy stood outside, as if the boy was both inside the house and not. Local records from that year are incomplete, but one name appears repeatedly in fragmented documents. Harlan Finch, a farmer, a widower, father of 3, filed a missing persons report in November of 1901, withdrawn 3 days later, reason unstated. Neighbors described strange behavior afterward, lights left on all night, windows covered, children kept indoors, a house that no longer answered knocks. One neighbor claimed she heard a child coughing late at night, deep, wet coughs that went on far too long. Another said she heard whispering coming from the walls, not voices, breathing words. The photograph surfaced again in 1974, included in a small exhibition of early American family portraits. On the second day, a visitor fainted. On the third, the exhibit was quietly rearranged so the photograph faced a wall. The curator later admitted that the boy's eyes no longer aligned with the rest of the image. They looked closer, he said, like they had adjusted. The final detail was the most dangerous one, because it could not be unseen. When the photograph was enlarged enough, when the grain surrendered its secrets, tiny marks became visible around the boy's neck. Not shadows, not damage. Fingertip bruising? Uneven. Human. As if someone had held him upright long after his body wanted to fall. As if the photograph was taken too late. Or worse, too early. In 1902, the Finch house burned down. No bodies were recovered. The fire was ruled accidental. The land was never rebuilt. Even now, grass grows poorly there. The photograph remains. It has never been destroyed. Every attempt to discard it fails. Lost shipments, mislabeled boxes, unexplained returns. It always comes back. And every time someone studies it too closely, they notice something new. A change in posture, a shift in focus, a suggestion of breath where breath should not exist. Because the photo from 1901 is not a memory. It is a moment that never finished happening. And the boy was never meant to be preserved. He was meant to be released. But the camera captured him in between, still responding, still holding on, and still aware that someone, someday, would finally see the details. This is where the photograph begins to explain itself. The photograph did not change all at once. That would have been easier to dismiss. It changed selectively. Only when it was observed. Only when someone stayed too long. The archivist who finally decided to study it properly did so under controlled conditions. Light steady. Temperature regulated. No one else in the room. He placed the photograph on a felt-lined table and documented every visible element. The house. The fence. The posture of each family member. Nothing moved. Nothing shifted. For the first hour. Then he noticed something wrong with the spacing. The boy on the right was standing closer to his sister than he had been in earlier reference scans. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to violate consistency. Photographs do not compress. People do. He compared the digitized copy to the physical print. The physical print showed something the scan had not. A faint distortion near the boy's mouth, as if the image had been disturbed during exposure, or as if the boy had tried to speak. In 1901, long exposures meant one thing above all else. Only the truly still survived the process intact. That was why the dead were sometimes photographed. They did not blur. They did not resist. They did not breathe. But this boy was too sharp, too present, too awake. The archivist found a small ledger tucked into a mislabeled county box weeks later. It belonged to the traveling photographer. Most entries were mundane. Dates. Locations. Payments. One page had been torn out. But the following page contained a note written at an angle, hurried and uneven. Mother insisted. Child unwell but responsive. Kept saying my name. The photographer's name had been scratched out. Under it, written later in a different hand. He wouldn't stop answering. Medical records from the area tell a quiet story. An outbreak of scarlet fever moved through the county in October of that year. Several children died. Others recovered slowly. Some were pronounced dead prematurely. Comas were not understood. Breathing could be shallow. Awareness could linger. And families, terrified of disease, buried quickly, or photographed quickly. The Finch boy's name appeared once in a church register. Elias Finch. Age 6. Cause of death. Fever. Date, November 14, 1901. The photograph was dated November 12th. Something had gone wrong, and the camera recorded it. People who viewed the image for extended periods began reporting similar symptoms. Pressure behind the eyes. A sensation of being held still. An urge not to blink. One woman claimed she could hear faint breathing when the room was quiet. Another swore the boy's fingers were curling tighter around the chair leg every time she looked away. The most disturbing account came from a conservator tasked with restoring the print. While cleaning the lower edge, he noticed a smear that had been mistaken for damage. Under magnification, it was unmistakable. A partial fingerprint. Small, child-sized, pressed from the inside of the emulsion, as if the boy's hand had been against the photograph, not the chair. At this point, the archivist stopped working alone. He insisted on witnesses. The photograph was mounted behind glass and placed on a stand. 4 people watched. Nothing happened for several minutes. Then, the youngest child in the group spoke. Why doesn't he close his mouth? Everyone looked. The boy's lips were slightly parted now. Not wide, just enough, as if air was moving through them. Someone suggested removing the photograph. Another suggested covering it. No one suggested destroying it. They all felt, without speaking it aloud, that doing so would be a mistake. The archivist reviewed the Finch property records next. The house had been inspected once after the fire. The report noted something strange. No beds were found upstairs. Only one small mattress in the cellar, positioned upright against the wall, with marks on the stone behind it, fingernail marks. At a child's height. The photograph was returned to storage. But it did not stay quiet. People began dreaming of it. Always the same dream. Standing still. Holding their breath. while a boy watched them from just out of frame, waiting for them to move, waiting for the exposure to end. This was when the photograph stopped being a document and started becoming a process, because whatever Elias Finch was caught inside, it wasn't just an image, it was a moment that had been stretched too far, and something inside it was still trying to finish what never properly ended. The photograph was not remembering the boy. The boy was remembering us, and he was learning how long we could stay still. By the third week, the photograph no longer needed to be viewed to be felt. People who had seen it, even briefly, began experiencing the same disturbance at the same time each night. Exactly 2:17 a.m., no alarms rang. No clocks chimed. They simply woke up, with the overwhelming sense that they were being held in place. One archivist described the sensation as pressure on the chest, not heavy, not painful, just firm. Like a hand reminding you not to move during a long exposure. Another said his jaw locked shut in sleep, teeth clenched so tightly he cracked a molar. A third woke with blood beneath his fingernails. All of them dreamed of the same thing, standing in front of a camera they could not see. A voice telling them to stay still. A child nearby, breathing too softly. The photograph was sealed inside a climate-controlled drawer. The room was locked. The building was secured. At 2:17 a.m., the drawer slid open on its own. Security footage showed nothing else moving. No human presence. No vibration. No mechanical fault. Just the drawer. Opening. When staff arrived the next morning, the photograph was no longer centered on its backing. It had shifted, barely, but enough that the boy's shoulder now overlapped his sister's arm. Something impossible, because photographs don't overlap. People do. A decision was made to investigate the Finch property directly. The land was privately owned now, untouched for decades. Locals refused to guide the team. One man spat on the ground when the name Finch was mentioned and said only this: that boy wasn't gone when they made him stand. The foundation stones of the old house were still there, charred, split. The cellar entrance had collapsed inward, but excavation revealed something no fire should have preserved. The stone walls were blackened, but smooth, as if exposed to heat from the inside. And on one wall, barely visible beneath soot, were lines scratched deep into the rock. Not random, measured, vertical marks. Counting marks, grouped in uneven clusters. Someone had been counting time. They found the mattress remains exactly where the old inspection report had claimed. Upright, pressed against the wall, as if someone had been made to stand on it. The stone behind it was worn down, not by years, but by movement. Subtle shifts, micro-adjustments, the kind made by someone trying very hard not to fall. The most disturbing discovery came last. Behind the mattress, wedged between stone and earth, was a small glass plate. A negative, cracked, but still readable. When cleaned and held to light, it revealed the photograph. The same family, the same pose, but this version was different. The boy's mouth was open wider, and his eyes were looking directly at the camera, terrified. Written along the edge of the plate, etched carefully with a sharp object, were words so faint they were almost missed. He moved. Back at the archive, the sealed photograph reacted to the discovery. At 2:17 a.m. that night, every security camera in the building froze on the same frame. The boy's face, closer than it had ever been, no longer standing behind the family, no longer part of the arrangement. He was at the front now, and his hand was no longer gripping the chair. It was pressed flat against the inside of the glass, as if testing it. Staff refused to enter the room after that. They quit in silence. No explanations. Just keys left on desks, doors unlocked. The photograph was moved one final time, not to storage, not to another archive, to a federal facility that specialized in things that did not behave like objects. It was logged, sealed, classified, and forgotten. Again. But forgetting does not undo exposure. And Elias Finch had learned something crucial during those long seconds in 1901. That stillness does not mean helplessness. That being observed is a kind of contact. And that if you are forced to remain aware long enough, you begin to notice the observer. And once you notice them, you can begin to move, very slowly, very carefully. Between the moments, between the frames, this was no longer a photograph that remembered a boy. It was a boy who had learned how photographs work, and he was adjusting. By the fourth month, the photograph no longer stayed contained to its frame, not physically, conceptually. People who had never seen it began reporting the same symptoms, the same dreams, the same time. 2:17 a.m. It no longer mattered whether the image was viewed. It had already been registered. Doctors were brought in. Psychologists. Sleep specialists. They found nothing wrong. Brains normal. Stress levels elevated but not abnormal. No shared medication. No shared environment. Except one thing. Every affected person had, at some point, handled archival material from the early 1900s. Letters, glass negatives, family portraits, anything exposed long enough to stillness. One psychologist made a mistake. He tried to reason with the phenomenon. He spoke aloud during a monitored session, addressing the empty room as if the boy could hear. "You're not alive," he said calmly. "You're an image. A moment. You can't change." The pressure hit immediately. Not violent, not sudden, just absolute. Every muscle in his body locked. Cameras recorded his eyes moving, not panicked, not wild, but focused. Listening. His heart rate slowed instead of rising. When he could move again, he whispered one sentence before losing consciousness. He doesn't want to move anymore. Analysis of the recovered negative revealed something horrifying. The image density around the boy was increasing. Photographic grain was clustering unnaturally, as if the emulsion itself were responding to repeated observation. The more the image was studied, the more defined he became, as if attention was finishing what the exposure had started. In 1901, the photographer had tried to retake the image. That was the part never recorded publicly. The torn ledger page, later recovered in fragments, described the moment. Second plate failed. Child would not hold. Mother insisted we try again. He screamed when I removed him. Removed him. From where? The final attempt to contain the photograph involved destruction. A controlled burn. The glass plate was placed inside a sealed furnace chamber. Temperature raised gradually. Cameras monitored everything. At precisely 2:17 a.m., the heat sensors failed. Not shut down. Failed. The glass did not crack. It softened. And something pressed outward from within. A small hand-shaped bulge appeared on the surface. Not a reflection. A displacement. The burn was aborted. No one spoke. After that, containment shifted from physical to procedural. No more viewing, no more analysis, no more discussion. The photograph was stored in darkness, not to protect people, to deprive the image. But deprivation works both ways, and Elias Finch had endured stillness longer than anyone else. He had learned patience in seconds stretched into eternity. He had learned control in silence. He had learned that awareness, when denied release, seeks structure. The dreams changed. Now people dreamed of standing behind the camera, holding it, feeling its weight, feeling the responsibility. The boy was no longer in the frame. He was beside them, watching, waiting. The last written report before the case was buried ended with a warning. The subject is no longer confined to representation. It responds to attention, memory, and stillness. Further observation may result in displacement. No one signed it, because the final detail was the most unsettling. The photograph, when last checked, showed only 4 people. The boy was gone. In his place was empty space, but the shadow remained. And it did not fall backward. It fell forward, out of the frame, toward whoever would look next. This was no longer about a boy trapped in an image. It was about an image that had learned how to let someone out, and whatever stepped closer was no longer waiting for the exposure to end. It was waiting for you to stay still long enough. After the boy disappeared from the photograph, the room where it was stored became impossible to enter for long. Not because of fear. Because of stillness. Anyone who crossed the threshold felt it immediately. The instinct to stop moving, to slow their breath, to hold position as if an unseen voice were counting silently. Several people reported that walking felt rude, disruptive, as if motion itself was a mistake. As if they were interrupting something mid-exposure. The facility logs from that period show a pattern no one wanted to acknowledge. Security guards assigned to the wing began freezing during rounds. Cameras captured them standing motionless for minutes at a time, eyes open, bodies upright, breathing shallow enough to be barely visible. When questioned later, none of them remembered stopping. They remembered waiting. Waiting for permission to move. At 2:17 a.m., the building no longer went quiet. It went synchronized. Air systems slowed together. Lights dimmed by a fraction of a second. Digital clocks hesitated, then corrected themselves. And somewhere inside the sealed room, something adjusted its position. A janitor, new, unbriefed, made the mistake of humming while cleaning near the wing. The sound cut off abruptly. He was found standing in the hallway, head tilted, lips parted as if about to speak. His body temperature was normal. His pulse steady. But he would not blink. When doctors finally broke the rigidity hours later, the only thing he said was, "He told me I was moving too much." The recovered records from 1901 began making sense. Neighbors hadn't heard screams from the Finch house. They heard coughing, correcting breaths. Someone learning how to stay quiet, how to remain present without motion. Elias Finch had not been trapped by death. He had been trapped by observation. Forced to stand. forced to remain aware, forced to be still while adults decided what to call him. And children, when made to endure endlessly, do not forget the rules they are taught. They master them. Inside the sealed room, motion sensors began triggering without displacement. No weight shift. No temperature change. No airflow. Just the suggestion of position. As if something had learned how to exist without occupying space. The final internal memo before the project was abandoned was written by someone who had stopped trying to sound professional. We are not containing an image. We are providing a stage. Stillness is not neutral. It is an invitation. After that, the photograph was removed. No documentation shows where it went, only that the room was sealed permanently and reclassified as structurally unsafe. But even after removal, the room did not empty. Pressure remained. Witnesses claim they could feel someone standing just behind them if they stayed long enough, not touching, not breathing, just waiting for them to stop moving. The dreams became clearer. No camera now, no family, just a boy standing beside the dreamer, correcting posture, guiding hands into position, adjusting chin angle, teaching them how to hold still without fear, without discomfort, without end. People who experienced the dreams stopped fearing death. They stopped fearing anything. They became excellent at waiting. Too excellent. One nurse stood beside a patient for 9 hours without shifting her weight once. Another man stood in the rain until hypothermia took him, calm and compliant, eyes fixed on nothing. They all shared the same expression. Concentration. The phenomenon was no longer attached to a photograph. It had become a technique, a discipline, a way of being present without resistance. And Elias Finch, if that was still his name, had found the perfect way to spread it. Not by force. By instruction, because stillness is contagious, and awareness, once stretched far enough, begins to prefer it. The boy had finally stepped out of the frame, and now he was teaching others how to join him. Not in death. In the space between moments, where nothing ends, and nothing is allowed to move. One part remained. The last one, the part no one survived long enough to fully explain, and that was when the stillness stopped waiting. The stillness did not spread like a disease, it spread like understanding. That was the final mistake. The first confirmed death caused directly by the phenomenon did not look like a death at all. A senior archivist was found standing in the center of her apartment, feet perfectly aligned, hands resting calmly at her sides. No sign of struggle, no sign of fear. Her eyes were open, focused on a blank wall. The medical report listed cardiac arrest, but the coroner added an unsanctioned note at the bottom of the page. Muscles showed no evidence of collapse. Body remained upright after death. As if she had been practicing. By then, the time no longer mattered. It still happened around 2:17 a.m., but clocks had stopped being reliable indicators. Some people experienced it at noon. Others while driving, a few while speaking mid-sentence. They would pause. Just for a moment. Long enough to listen. The last known document referencing the photograph came from a restricted behavioral research unit that never officially existed. It contained a single recorded interview. No questions. Only answers. Spoken calmly by a subject whose eyes never blinked. He's not trapped, the subject said. He finished the exposure. We're the ones still moving. The recording ended with the sound of fabric shifting, someone adjusting posture, followed by silence so complete it registered as pressure on the microphones. The original photograph was never recovered, not because it was lost, because it was no longer necessary. Whatever Elias Finch had become no longer required an image. The image had been a doorway, and doorways are not destinations. In 1901, a child was made to stand when he should have been allowed to lie down. He was told to be still, told to hold his breath, told that movement would ruin the moment. So he learned. He learned better than anyone expected. And he learned that stillness, when perfected, is not passive. It is control. Today, the land where the Finch house once stood is unremarkable. No warning signs, no markers, no memorial. But people who pass through too slowly sometimes feel it. The urge to stop, to adjust their stance, to hold position just a little longer than necessary. They describe it as peaceful. They are wrong, because peace ends. Stillness does not. And somewhere, in the space between one moment and the next, something that learned patience in 1901 is still watching how long we can remain aware without moving. Still correcting. Still waiting. Some photographs look innocent. Until you understand what they captured, this was not a picture of a family. It was a lesson, and the lesson is simple. If you stay still long enough, something will notice. This story was taken from the edges of forgotten history, the kind that doesn't fade, only waits. Welcome to Forgotten Remains.